caring for these properties for us. So we're looking for a team leader for each property, and as well team members that are willing to go out on a monthly visit to check out the properties, look at the condition of the trails, the signage, for evidence of intrusion or problems that rare needs to be alerted to maybe participate in some invasive species work, definitely to report wildlife sightings. So lots of great things to do if you're interested in out and doing a monthly hike on one of the properties. So we're having a little training session and orientation for that program on Thursday, March 25th. We're doing it at 3 p.m. and again at 7 p.m. So register at that link, and I'll also put that in the chat if you're interested in participating and coming out and learning more. And yeah, hope to see a lot of your faces soon. Thanks very much.
Thanks a lot, Jenna. We'll likely put the link for that up on our Facebook page, but it will be in the chat. And then we'll talk about some upcoming events with Nature Guelph. Next Wednesday, Robert Pavlis is quite a well-known gardening author and educator. We'll be talking about how to get those seeds that you picked up from the seed workshop to turn into mature plants. You will need to register for that on Zoom. You can see the Facebook event page for registration instructions. Birdwing has their second series of this year, and they're going to be talking about birding optics, how to choose them, how to use them. So find out everything you need to know about binoculars, and there'll also be an atlas update for the Breeding Bird Atlas. That's next Tuesday, March 23rd. They meet at 7, not 7:30. The Wildflower Series, we have a special extra event this month in partnership with Trees for Guelph and Lisa McTaggart, and we're bringing in, pretty excited to bring in Lorraine Johnson, very well-known native plant author, who's going to be talking about the small-scale big impact actions we can all take in our landscaping to protect the planet. And finally, the speaker series next month will be the Highgate Mastodon story with Peter Russell from the University of Waterloo Earth Sciences Museum. And apparently it's a bit of a mystery story and pretty exciting. Again, register for all these events for Zoom, and you will need to see our Facebook event page for the registration instructions. So I'm just going to remind you one more time to mute your microphone, turn off your video, and if you have any questions during the talk, please post them to the chat and we will answer those questions at the end. And now I'm very pleased to introduce Janet Sumner. Janet has 30 years experience working as an environmentalist, and since 2003 has been executive director of the Wildlands League, where she has led a dynamic dedicated to wilderness protection and ecosystem certainty for our large landscapes. The Wildlands League mission is to protect 50% of Canada. And in the course of her work, Janet has slept with polar bears, walked in herds of caribou, flown millions of hectares in helicopters, and negotiated with some of the biggest industry players there are. Under Janet's leadership, the Wildlands League has accomplished substantial legislative reforms, both provincially and federally. In 2017, Janet was appointed co-chair of the National Advisory Panel with a mandate to provide recommendations on how Canada can meet the Target 11, protecting 17% of terrestrial lands and inland waters in Canada by 2020. But I'm thinking maybe we missed that target. And in 2019, Janet was appointed the Special Representative on Nature for Canada. So very welcome, Janet.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me here, and I look forward to this evening. I suspect it will be an interesting conversation. I'm just going to share my screen so you can see the presentation that I've put together, and I will. And hopefully you can hear me. If there's any challenges, I'll just take the headset off, but this allows me to hear things a little bit differently. So once again, I'm the Executive Director at Wildlands League. We have been around since 1968, so a little bit more than 50 years, started with a campaign to get logging out of Algonquin. And now we work in mostly in Ontario, but in various places across Canada. And you'll see some of that in tonight's presentation. So as was mentioned by Judy, I have been the executive director at Wildlands League for, well, now 17 years. And then I was the National Advisory Panel co-chair and came up with a report on how Canada could meet its targets. And we will miss the target to 17% by end of 2020. We are moving and moving quickly. And that has been the advancement of putting together the Nature Fund and the federal government actually starting to drive on this. And then I was very lucky to be seconded and work as the Minister's Special Representative on Nature in helping Canada to achieve that target. So I'm hoping that we'll have hit the 17 by 23, and now you know that the federal government has committed to 25% by 2025 and 30% by 2030. So I'm still working on helping achieve that now from my seat firmly at Wildlands League. So maybe I'll just start with a few facts. So some people have most likely read, you all are fairly engaged on the nature issue, but you may have seen that this quote that around 1 million animal and plant species are now threatened with extinction. And that's from the international, out of the IPBES report. And so it's sort of the equivalency of the IPCC report on climate change, but it's on nature. This just gives you a little bit more detail on that, and it shows the sorry, I'm just going to move my here. So the red is indicating where there is indicates the percentage of that category that's damaged or lost or otherwise been affected. The blue shows how much of it as a percentage is intact or remaining unaffected. So it paints I think a fairly stark picture of concern. And this is for the frontiers in conservation science. This is the Out of the Living Planet report and State of Canada's birds. You can see in Canada, we're not immune, but we have species that are in decline, mammal populations, amphibian and reptile, fish populations, and bird species. It is unevenly distributed across Canada. We don't see it the same way in every region. And certainly in southwestern Ontario, that is, I would suggest it is Canada's ecological hotspot with less than 1% protected, the highest number of endangered species, the highest biodiversity, but also the most significant threats to that biodiversity. And you can see this from this map. This is land use, and it starts to paint a picture that we've got kind of different realities, if you will, that exist across Canada. In the north, it's the least impacted from an anthropogenic footprint. We have an opportunity there to maybe get out ahead of the challenge. And in the south is the most severely impacted. It is where we have our cities and agricultural lands. And the green, or the chartreuse color that is there, is where we have resource extraction and nature sort of trying to fight for space, if you will. This is a little bit more about the science. This is an interesting map that came out from the United Nations this year, and it shows where we have carbon and we have biodiversity conservation. So it has brought the two together, which I found really quite interesting. And you can see the large carbon pools, if you will. This is going to be important a little bit later, but this is Canada's Hudson's Bay, James Bay lowlands, the Amazon, the Congo, and then Southeast Asia. And most people often, many people think about the Amazon as one of the most significant carbon pools on the planet. But in fact, our Hudson Bay, James Bay lowlands are really quite significant. And that is one of the things that at Wildlands League we've been very focused on and are trying to bring more attention to. Just to give you a really great picture of that, this is one of the pictures that we took flying over northern Ontario, and it is in the Hudson Bay, James Bay lowland complex. And this is that map where it suggests that you've got that great density of biodiversity and carbon overlapping. And then that's where it is in this region here. And that's actually one of the other great shots that when we go up and do some of our canoe trips, we like to be able to see the land that we are talking about and understand it from the perspective of boots on the ground, paddling it and seeing it. And in the far north in Ontario, this massive peat bog complex is 50% water. It's really quite spectacular. So I'll maybe just mention that, as you know, that Canada has committed to 25% protection by 2025, and that's land and sea. And that we have committed to a 30% protection by 2030. And these are targets on the way to something. This is the science is indicating that it is likely that it could be in the neighborhood of 50% is what the planet needs, or some number approaching 50%. So Canada has now committed to the 25 by 25 and 30 by 30. And what's also interesting is when the new Biden administration started, they committed to 30 by 30. And what happened last week was Russia has committed now to 30 by 30, and China had already committed as well. So if you think about some of the large economic powers in the world, which these are three of them, US, China, and Russia, they have now all committed to 30 by 30. They are also, the four are also probably the largest land masses that we have worldwide, and now are all committed to this. This creates opportunities for working together and a potential to really addressing some of the problems if people are serious and their political will is there, and that we can actually move together. And certainly for Canada and the US to really start to think in a continental way, and perhaps even work with Mexico to think at that continental scale. And I would suggest that we even need to think at a hemispheric scale, certainly with birds. So again, if you remember, the state of the problem is not evenly distributed across the country. And the percentage, that's actually one of the very interesting things, is that the first time that we worked on this, trying to get to 17%, the program became very, very focused on the percentages. And so, and I'm not trying to say that we are not trying to meet those, we still are. But if you can imagine that the goal is not just what's the percentage, but it is, do we have healthy ecosystems? And are they thriving? Are they supporting the biodiversity of life? Because really fundamentally what we're trying to stop is the loss of biodiversity. It's not just about hitting a target of a percentage. So this is the nature of the problem. And what that means is you can't just go and get your 30% in the least impacted places. You have to go and get your 30% and get to healthy ecosystems across the range of possibilities in Canada, not just where it's perhaps the least impacted. And so to that end, we've done some long and hard thinking at Wildlands League about what would a plan for Canada look like? How would you put that into place? You essentially start with over here on the left with what the problem is. If you're going to build a healthy planet that has, that's a healthy planet and a safe climate, you need to start with what the problem is. You need to understand the science, and then from that start to create a plan. And that plan, from my perspective and what I've seen in the conversations that I've been involved in, if you will, it starts with those sort of three different conditions of Canada. And what you might look at in the south is where you would want to do more urban protection, more ecological corridors, planting trees, restoration projects, building natural infrastructure that can literally work as structural integrity between natural areas, creating interconnected corridors, establishing national marine conservation areas in our Great Lakes. Many people don't understand that we can actually do we can do protection in the Great Lakes. And because it's international with the US, it's binational, we can use the tool under Parks Canada called National Marine Conservation Areas. And even though it's water, it still counts towards the terrestrial target because it's freshwater. So there is an ability to work on this in the south. And I would also suggest it's about bringing different ways of doing protection together. So for example, in my tenure at Wildlands League, the groups that work on crown lands tend to work very differently than the groups that work on private lands. And I think it's time to come together, and certainly our work that we're doing now is trying to build bridges between not only what stewardship programs farmers might be doing, but what is happening on private lands, what might be happening as OECMs, what even woodlot owners might be doing, and starting to look at the parcels that we have and how they can all contribute to a more resilient, healthy ecosystem. And then in that band of Middle Canada, we have very, very much focused on caribou protection. And the reason for that is, yes, we care about the species, but more importantly, we care about the fact that they are an indicator of overall ecosystem health. So we think in terms of if you can actually achieve good, healthy caribou, then you can actually accomplish large-scale protection and ecosystem health, because you've actually taken care of one of the species that indicates overall ecosystem health. We work on the forest stewardship certification and how forestry is done. So it's not just where you do forestry or where you don't do forestry, but how you do it. And the ability to create more new protected areas, almost always in partnership with our Indigenous peoples. And then even here, you could be working on ecological corridors. Some of those big ones would be places like Yellowstone to Yukon, or other corridors that might exist. And also, I would suggest even starting to think through the lens of watersheds. Many of you will have heard about the coal mining that was being suggested in the Rockies. Well, those watersheds like the Saskatchewan River flow to Lake Winnipeg and then into the Hudson Bay. And so just thinking in terms of how that watershed moves and thinking at a landscape level, and what do you do with that in terms of thinking of that as an ecological corridor and creating wildlife crossings and interconnected networks of protection. It also will probably require that we start to think through a lens of economic diversification. Can we be as resilient ecologically if we are only thinking through the lens of resource extraction? And I think it's time to broaden the suite of tools that we have for economic vitality in Middle Canada. And that may, in my estimation, start to include a carbon strategy, which is about potentially even recognizing where you have avoided logging or regeneration of seismic lines, so that you can actually start to bring nature back. And is there a way to reward that through the lens of a carbon strategy? And I can answer questions about that later if it's too detailed. In the north, we have probably some of our biggest opportunities for large-scale conservation. That's creating, in partnership with Indigenous peoples, more protected areas. It's working with Indigenous partnerships like Guardians programs. In Ontario, it's working with Mushkegowuk, Kitchener-Mekuzab and Inuig, that's KI, Moose Cree, and there are many, many more Indigenous nations that want to do large-scale protection. As I noted before, the peatlands really need to be a focus because they have enormous amounts of carbon there, and we really can't afford, if we're going to get to a safe climate, releasing that carbon. And then finally, I'll maybe just go to the marine aspect, which is we're very lucky in Ontario. We actually do have a seashore, which is at the very northern end of it, and it is Hudson Bay, James Bay. And we are now working to protect that coast and that marine treasure, or that marine oasis, and see, I think it's up over a 9 million hectare national marine conservation area in the Hudson Bay, James Bay. And I'll just maybe start at the top. So this is the work that we've been doing for some time now. And we're working with Mushkegowuk. They have said that they would like to see this area in blue protected. There is an equally, not maybe equally, but there is a large area to the west of that that is bordering on Manitoba. So that's the Western Hudson Bay. And then the yellow that you see there is the eastern James Bay, which is the Quebec Cree are interested and have started to move a project forward. So we could see a national marine conservation area go all the way from Manitoba through to Quebec and cover from Western Hudson Bay through to the eastern side of James Bay, which would be an enormous achievement. The work that we're working on very specifically is the Hudson Bay, James Bay in blue. You see some of the facts and figures there, which is, I've been really fortunate. Some of the trips that we've taken, I've actually landed in Pewanik. That was a trip that was planes, trains, and automobiles to get there. And it was about 6 hours in various different forms of transportation to get to Pewanik. And then we traveled by motorized canoe out to the coast, which was 3 hours, and then 3 hours east, and camped there and slept with, that was one of the places that we got to sleep with polar bears. But as we came out of the mouth of the Winnisk, just at where the Winnisk meets Hudson Bay, we were greeted with, I think it was like a pod, if you will, of belugas, almost swimming like dolphins. And they were swimming with us. And I looked up at one point and I was just completely awestruck. And it felt like there must have been 100 out there. And now I know that that's the greatest gathering of belugas on the planet. And I've been lucky enough to be traveling with them. And then when we landed on land, we got to be very, very close to a polar bear who played a little hide and seek with us. So that was also a lot of fun. But we have the most southern population of polar bears that sometimes go down as far as Moose Factory in some years, but for the most part are a little bit further north. I've seen them in Attawapiskat and all along that coast, quite frankly. And as many of you will know, because I've just listened to the fact that you're avid birders, there's lots of species of geese and ducks and shorebirds. And the other really exciting thing about the boreal is that 40% of the continent's birds breed in the boreal. So what we do in Canada is going to make a tremendous amount of difference, not just for Canada, but for the health of the entirety of North America, because the birds, 40% of the birds are breeding up in the boreal. So it is a trust that we have to take care of this land. And I'm going to try to work this video because it is one that we've done with the Mushkegowuk people, and I think you'll enjoy it. So let's see if I can get to this. I'm gonna have to do another share. Let's see.
We're not catching the sound, or is that just starting?
Sorry, can you hear the sound?
We're not catching the sound, but we've got the good video.
Okay. So I'm going to share the link for that, so you can actually watch it on your own, and then you can actually hear the sound, because it's really quite good. And I'm sorry that I was not able to share that as well as I could have. So I will let you watch that at your leisure, but I'll go back to the slide presentation. Okay, so this is the Mushkegowuk territory, just to give you another perspective. This is the marine aspect of it, and this is their land, which is, as you probably can tell from the previous map, is a lot of the Hudson Bay, James Bay peatland complex, the lowland complex. And to orient you, this is also where the Ring of Fire is being proposed, and where they've done quite a bit of mineral exploration. And so I think that for many in Mushkegowuk, it was quite, when we did this map, we did it with them, and it was quite revealing. This is actually the northern limit of forestry here. And you can, the yellow is our mining claims, and these orange are withdrawals. But you can see that they sort of looked, the Mushkegowuk people looked at this map and kind of went, wow, this is really developed down here. And is this the fate that we have for the rest of our territory? And so I think it is a galvanizing map in the sense that it sends a message that, you know, maybe we have to get ahead of this and start to really think about what we want our land to look like. And so that these are some of the maps that we've been just developing in our work with Mushkegowuk. This is another look at it. This is the peatland complex here. And this is a large withdrawal that Kitchename, Kuzup, and Innuig did a number of years ago. And they would like to see this area here moved forward as an Indigenous protected and conserved area. We're also working with them on that kind of a project as well. This is so, and as I mentioned before, I think that it's also really important for Canada, and this is just an example of it, to really start thinking from a watershed lens. And in Ontario, we have 5 of the last undammed rivers north of 60. And these are the watersheds. And so this is what the peatlands look like when you fly over them. It's just, the colors are, this maybe doesn't do enough justice to it, but the colors are just quite spectacular. I'm going to see if it'll play a little bit. So you can just, but you just go forever like that, just flying over these peat bogs. It's just an amazing experience. And what we're doing right now, this is a mineral exploration. This is advanced exploration in the Ring of Fire. This work is drilling holes into the ground to figure out what the mineral find is underneath. As you can see, it's a wetland complex, and it's creating quite a bit of damage. And that's what it looks like when they drill a hole, drag the machine, drill a hole, drag the machine, drill a hole, drag the machine. And they did this over, I think it was 600,000 hectares. And the lines and the grid pattern are all in the land because it's a peat bog, and so it's just been dragged over it. And we're not counting this in terms of our carbon emissions. We're not sitting down and saying, okay, so what kind of releases happened from this? What damage was done from this? And we're not counting that. So we're not really being climate smart in how we're thinking about our peatlands. This is similar. This is actually in the opening introduction, it said I've flown, millions of kilometers. So this is one of my great days at the office where I got to fly over seismic lines in northeastern Alberta. And seismic lines, for anybody who doesn't know what they are, is when they're trying to figure out what is below ground in terms of oil and gas. They drive a truck along, they make one of these lines in the forest, and they drive a truck along, and they put a seismic or an explosive device into the ground. They release it. That creates a seismic sound that bounces out, and it sends them information around what is the density of the rock formations, and is that oil or is that gas? Is it bitumen? What is it? What is the underground find? And that's what they do to sort of plot what is the underground reality for the oil and gas resources that they can find. And they do this in a grid pattern, and it connects to oil pads and wellheads, et cetera. And so you see these. I think Canada has now over 1 million kilometers of seismic lines. The density is really quite bad or quite apparent in Alberta, as you can see. We also have it in Northeast British Columbia, in Saskatchewan, Newfoundland, and in the Northwest Territories. So this footprint is there. And some of these have been there since the 70s. Some of these have been abandoned for a long time, but this is another sort of big footprint that we've got in that kind of middle Canada area. We've been working for a long time on logging in Algonquin. That's another place that we have to do better if we're going to stop the collapse of nature, and that's stop end logging in our parks. Not have parks that are protected areas, and their highest and best purpose has to be for ecological integrity, not to maintain logging. In Algonquin, what we're asking for is an end to the logging in the park, immediately protecting the old growth areas, and protecting the world-class brook trout lakes and streams, and restoring 40% of the logging roads. Currently, there's over 5,000 kilometers of logging roads in Algonquin alone. So we do work on forestry, and that work on forestry, as I said, is also overlaps with caribou. And one of the reasons that we work on caribou is because they overlap really quite a bit with where we have high concentrations of carbon in our soils. And this is just another figure that I found really compelling for me anyway. This is out of a recent report done by Risa Smith. And you can see that Canada has a commitment right now to planting 2 billion trees. The green indicates the low estimate, and the orange or reddish color is the high estimate. So even it doesn't matter what if it's low or high in terms of planting trees, but the best and highest use of what we could be doing is creating protected areas in terms of a carbon. If you put a carbon lens on working on nature. Proforestation is when you're actually building some of these areas back and then protecting them. Maybe now I'll turn to the south, which is going to be a lot closer to home. And we built these maps. We did this actually before the pandemic, so over a year ago. And we took these out on the road. And what we wanted to do is really start to understand from the ground up what the opportunities were for creating networks of protection in Southern Ontario. Because what we were trying to do is model, if you will, if you say we've got this north, south, and middle kind of approach in Canada that we're suggesting could be the way to help reach that 30 by 30 target, but more importantly, how we can actually build back all of our ecosystems and make sure they're healthy and thriving. And in the south, we said, well, let's go and start having a conversation with everybody. And we put these maps, they were large floor maps, they were about 8 foot by 10 foot. And we asked people to come over and walk on them and put little markers down where they might suggest, because they know the land best, they live there, and said, why don't you take a walk on the map and give us some ideas on where we could create more protection or do more restoration, or where you would recommend having a new national urban park, or what that might look like. And what I found really interesting was all of these grid lines that we saw when we built that map of sort of vegetation cover and tree cover. And Dave in my office, he said, well, I think that's the back 40 of agriculture, all these agricultural lands. But those too represent opportunities for creating connectivity. And the federal government, in their speech from the throne, I think it was, promised that they would do more ecological corridors. So in our worldview, what we're hoping is that we see an expansion of Rouge National Urban Park. We want to see the Greenbelt get recognized for its potential to be an ecological corridor. And the IUCN passed a guidance on ecological corridors. I think it was last summer. And what it said is an ecological corridor isn't necessarily a protected area, but it performs an ecological function. So it might be mammal movement. It might be, this vegetation that we have here that we're trying to keep. So it doesn't have to be in full protection, but it's going to fulfill some kind of ecological function. And I think that there are many elements of the Greenbelt that could do that, and that I would like to see Canada choose the Greenbelt as one of its first ecological corridors. I know they're working right now on coming up with what the Canadian definition for ecological corridors would be. And we would like to see, for the Toronto region, for example, is that you could start looking at the regeneration of the Don Valley and the Humber. And then there's another piece, and I think I have it on another map that I'll show. But you can see Guelph in here, and just how much connectivity and expansion of the Greenbelt could provide. And I've got a couple of other maps too here. Yeah, so this is the one that I was going to mention. We've got the Don River here. You've got the Humber. There's this new regeneration that's happening along the Meadoway, bringing it back as a meadow. It's actually just up the road from me. Actually, I take my dog for a walk there. But it's an expansion of the Rouge. This is the Pickering Airport lands. We'd like to see those added to the Rouge. I know that the Rouge, I spoke to the superintendent there. He's saying that they could easily plant, if there were available, 500,000 trees in about an 18-month period to do regeneration projects in the Rouge. They're working a lot on hydrology in the Rouge as well. And I know that they're talking about reclaiming some of the paved areas to build back some of the hydrology. We've got areas like Coutts Escarpment. They want to add more private protection, but also I would see regeneration as possibilities there. But really start to, again, think at a landscape level. And what does this mean if we were actually think of it as not just all these separate little projects, but rather rebuilding the structural integrity of nature and creating ecosystems that can thrive again. And so the 2 billion trees, I'm not against planting the 2 billion trees, but doing it in such a way that it actually starts to build upon the other pieces, like you might do natural infrastructure and planting a couple of million trees. And I think the latest estimate by the Greenbelt was something like 54 million trees they were suggesting in the Greenbelt area. So really seeing this as an entire project that has different tools associated with it. Here's another area that we had looked at as well. And actually, I don't know if you can see this, but I have my water bottle here from the Save Ojibwe Shores, and that's down here in Windsor. It's about creating a new national urban park in the Windsor area. And it is the most endangered ecosystem in Canada, in Windsor. It's also the flood capital of Canada. And you can see that the connectivity here, if we could actually rebuild some of this, would be about bringing it almost to Point Pelee and bringing it down this way, because you've got a little bit of green here. And in terms of the Ojibwe Shores project, it also, there is I don't know, I know lots of folks who like I grew up in London, Ontario, and we spent a lot of time in Sarnia and all throughout this area. And so if you're familiar with it, there's a creek called Turkey Creek, and it's concrete on either side of it. And if you could rewild that or regenerate it and take out the concrete and make it have natural borders, et cetera, it could start to function as it was intended. And this part of Windsor, this place where they want to do the Ojibwe Shores, it acts like a natural sponge, so it can actually help with the flooding that is occurring in the Windsor area. But again, it's this idea of building connectivity back, working with farmers who might be doing stewardship projects, or maybe they want to do something around rebuilding the hydrology on their lands, or doing some kind of stewardship project there. The other place that I found really interesting was all of this green along the Thames River. And we're toying with the idea, we've done a number of years where we've done a Paddle the Rouge event. And we had been thinking last summer that we would do a Paddle the Thames event, and I would really dearly love to go and paddle a good portion of the Thames. I thought that would be a lot of fun. And then down here, actually near where my dad lives in St. Thomas, you've got all of this green in and around here. So it's just begging for some kind of visionary to start thinking about projects and building back so much of this. And I guess for me, it's also really important to not think of these as all different separate strategies, but they each help each other. As I mentioned before, especially from an avian perspective, if birds are flying south or butterflies are flying south, they're going to be traveling along many of these corridors and starting to think of them as interconnected. And how does this work in ways, and even when you cross over into Detroit, many of the people in Detroit come into Windsor and use these areas. And so seeing these not as separate ingredients, but as part of the whole. One of the other projects that we worked on, which I found really fascinating, this was a map that was created by Trent University and the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry. And it's kind of like an electrical grid map. And they modeled how mammals move across the landscape, and they turn things into sort of electrical circuits. And the red are kind of like pinch points. And sometimes it's a natural pinch point, like when you've got an island or trying to jump across a peninsula. And then, but they're also like they're good areas for high conductivity. This is Toronto. So it's essentially basically saying mammals can't move across it very well. Whereas this is the Greenbelt. You get high connectivity here. You've got lots of connectivity here and in and around here. So again, it's another interesting piece. So when I saw this map, I asked my staff, I said, well, this is Algonquin. So I said, what are the connectivity possibilities of being able to build a connected corridor that goes from maybe Georgian Bay to Algonquin? And so Dave in my office, he started working with other groups, and we started to say, okay, we're going to be agnostic about what kind of parcel, like who owns it or who has jurisdiction on it. And we set up meetings with a number of other groups, and we said, could you start to bring some of your knowledge of the areas and puzzle pieces of land and start to build them together in a way, or tell us if it's possible to create this connected corridor. And I'll just mention, this is the Greenbelt here. This is an existing provincial park, as is this one. And then all these parcels started to emerge along the way. Now, not all of them are done. This is Algonquin. But this is a conceptual framework for starting to create the potential for a connected corridor that goes from Georgian Bay to Algonquin. So for me, that was the start of us doing this mapping and asking people to think about building corridors and what that could potentially look like. And it meant that we could think beyond ourselves to like what the larger mission, if you will, is, which is to build back all of the structure of Canada. So in the South especially, there's an opportunity to build a conservation economy. Green Infrastructure Ontario did this great report that was pre-COVID, and it looked at, could you grow jobs? And I think the 420,000 number is my estimate, if you were to take that and expand it across Canada. But they had looked at being able to grow, I think it was 120,000 jobs by 2030, if you were to make investments and grow natural infrastructure, that could be actually a job engine. And I'm suggesting if you did that everywhere in Canada, that you could maybe grow 400,000 jobs. I don't have more than just an extrapolation of the Green Infrastructure Ontario numbers. But to my mind, if we were to truly invest in building natural infrastructure and really be intentional about it, it would be a great tool for building jobs back in a post-pandemic world. We'd be able to grow vegetation and tree cover. And I think it's Carolyn in Canada has a target of a 30% natural vegetation cover. And really starting to think at this landscape level, where we're looking at connected networks of protection. So my message to people is we've got this if we want to. We can pick up shovels and get busy on this no matter where you are in Canada. We can think about how our landscape is connected to all the other parcels of land that we have in Canada, and how the rivers flow and how we think about carbon and what it means to keep the north protected, but also the oceans. And really start to think at this landscape level, and we can meet the targets of 30%, but we can also meet the greater target, which is to stop the decline in biodiversity. So, and I'll maybe just finish with this, which is that for us and the work that we do, it's in partnership with Indigenous people. And it is about building this sense of ethical space as well between, I guess, not necessarily just with Indigenous people, but certainly recognizing that there are two worldviews there, and bringing those worldviews together in an ethical way allows us to work together to build a brighter future for the rest of the country. So maybe I'll stop there and see if there's any questions.
So thanks a lot, Janet. There were some questions came up. So let's go back to the beginning of them and see where we come. So question, could you, and this was, you just touched on at the end, but this was one of the first questions out. Could you speak about the opportunities for and the importance of Indigenous leadership within these conservation and land restoration efforts?
Yeah, well, we've been working across Canada. It almost always, like, I mean, just doing Rouge National Urban Park, I believe there are 9 Indigenous groups around the Indigenous Circle advising the Rouge National Urban Park. Much of that is, and some of that is about building back Indigenous history, the sense of the land, but also learning from Indigenous peoples, like their oral history and their ability to recall what were some of this. I was just having a conversation last week about this, is that when we're thinking about the Rouge and thinking about what are the species that we're going to be regenerating rebuilding there, are those going to be the species that we know about, or are we going to reach back and speak with Indigenous peoples who might have a longer term memory and be able to say, these were some of the species that have been the vegetation that's been lost, and they actually were much more resilient, and let's be intentional about bringing some of that back, recognizing that climate change is coming and we might need species that are more resilient. So we can go from everywhere from like that to meeting with Chief Duckworth in Windsor, and her saying to me, one of the reasons that she wants to see a national urban park there is because they want to do ceremony again on land, and that they right now don't have any land base from which to do sacred ceremony. And so it would be really great if we could build back some of the native species and be able to have ceremony for the Indigenous people. So there's everything from that to like working with Mushkegowuk, or thinking about their land, and they want to keep the traditional ways of life. And for example, a number of years ago, it must have been when I first started at Wildlands Lake, I got a phone call from Moose Cree, who phoned me up and said, well, you know, we've done the math, and it makes sense to keep the trees rather than to cut them down. So we don't want to have any more logging in the North French. We'd like to keep the trees standing. And that was really prescient of them. I mean, this is like 15 years ago. They're telling me that the math on the carbon equation is going to work out better if we keep the trees standing. Well, they're right. And so I think that Indigenous peoples have lots to teach us, and by working together in partnership and learning from each other, we can build stronger connections to the land for everybody, but also we can have new ways of doing conservation for things that we might not even have thought of, because Indigenous people have a different use of the land. And so whether it's ceremony or I've also been schooled by elders in Attawapiskat, taking a picture of I took a picture up there of a caribou. I was doing a presentation on caribou, and I was showing some images that we had captured on the Slate Islands, in just off the coast of on the Slate Islands, which are just in the north part of Lake Superior. And I was showing these pictures to a room full of elders who were there as part of a caribou workshop. And one of the elders looks at me and goes, "That caribou's not from here." And I had to laugh. I said, "You're right. How did you know?" He said, "Oh, well, the rough is all wrong." I was like, "Okay, well, you're right. That caribou's not from here." So there's lots to be learning as we venture forth in conservation, and so I'm eager for the journey. I think it's an exciting time.
Were some of the groups that you're working on, when you had the 10 groups, were some of them Aboriginal groups and Indigenous groups?
Yeah, I believe so. I mean, I wasn't personally at that table. Dave was at that table. And so I do know that he was working as part of the Southern Ontario Nature Collective. There was Indigenous groups that were part of that. Yeah.
Thanks. So our next questions were, are there any sort of incentives for governments to actually pursue 25% by 2025, 30% by 2030? Any sort of legal or economic consequences or deterrents aside from climate collapse if they do not achieve those goals?
I think that so the legal mechanisms aren't as much there. On climate change, obviously, that's being challenged right now in terms of the federal government saying there's a price on pollution, and 2 or 3 provincial governments have challenged that. The mechanisms that can be used, for example, would be the species at risk, and its ability to enforce protection for species. For example, the caribou file. Caribou ranges across Canada are collapsing, and under the species at risk legislation, the federal government has the ability to enforce that. It's always tough though, because the provinces technically have the jurisdiction on the land. So it's hard for a federal government to come in and say, we're putting an emergency order here and we're going to seize this land. If you can imagine what kind of an uproar that would cause, even if technically you have the ability to do it, but the legal tool is there. It is possible. We've seen that happen on sage grouse. We've seen it happen on the chorus frog. We've seen it happen in a few places. Caribou are far more wide-ranging species, but that exists to provide some, potential incentive to push governments to do the right thing. The carrot, though, was the method that was being used the last time, which was under the Challenge Fund, where the federal government had $1.3 billion that they were investing, and said to provinces and territories, we would like to, accomplish protection in your jurisdiction. And I was at the table when the minister was meeting with some of these jurisdictions and saying, here's the number of areas that others, like for example, the many Indigenous nations and some, environmental groups, or perhaps maybe even private land trusts would put areas forward and say, we're prepared to take this through to full protection. They would put a proposal into the Challenge Fund, and then the conversation would happen with the respective jurisdiction. Okay, we've received, in the case of, I think British Columbia put forward, there were 60 proposals put forward there. They then sat down with the provincial government and said, there's 60 proposals. Are you prepared to agree to these, or at least engage in them and see if you can get to an agreement? And governments would say yes or no to whatever variety of number that they felt that they could say yes or no to. In some cases, provinces would also put forward ideas and ask for funding. And the premise was, and this is one of the recommendations of the National Advisory Panel, is if you put money on the table, then provinces will do some of it because they want to get some of the funds. Probably the province that made some of the most ambitious gains, and it's not big hectares, but it was ambitious for them, was, I think it was a doubling of protection in Nova Scotia. They just announced 20 new protected areas. Quebec did a tremendous amount. There are a lot of areas that got protected there. The Cree put forward a large land base, and I think it was the largest recipient of funds from the federal government. There were big protected areas put forward in Northwest Territories and the Yukon. Ontario didn't put big numbers on the board and said no to many things. So there was not an ability to force governments under that. It was more of a carrot, and in some cases, could you embarrass by looking over the shoulder at who else was doing good stuff? The Manitoba is moving forward on some really good parcels of land. The Seal River, that was put forward by the Decho. As I said, many of these were Indigenous protection areas. In Ontario, the two that we were working on that were put forward was the Kitchener-Kuzabeniniwig in Northwestern Ontario and Moose Cree. And some areas that didn't get put forward were because the timeline was, the expectation was that they would have to be finished by 2020. And we're hoping that there will be another round of funding for another, if you will, another challenge fund round, so that some of the areas that obviously are going to go past the 2020 timeline, like, for example, the Mushkegowuk area, could be put forward under a second round. So that's sort of some of the tools that they have. On the ocean, it's much easier because the jurisdiction there is more federal. Even in the Great Lakes, there is a potential to do national marine conservation areas, and that is a Parks Canada tool. And the jurisdiction is mixed. And so it would be more of a conversation with Ontario to see if we could move that forward. So hopefully that gives you a few answers.
Your next question would be, can it be caribou in Southern Ontario as an indicator species, or would you use some other indicator species?
Yeah, different indicator species. They don't go as far south as on Southern Ontario. And we've looked at that, and I'm not a species expert, but I think Dave's been looking at that in our office, and we've been trying to figure out what would be a good indicator. And probably you could have 2 or 3 of those in Southern Ontario, and maybe pick them by the ecosystem. They could be your bellwether of whether or not you're doing well. Caribou is a really easy one in the boreal. And what I also liked about it is because it almost entirely overlapped with where we had a large density of carbon. So you were basically getting almost a 2-for-1. You were getting ecosystem health, but you were also going to get protect your large carbon pools.
Thanks. This is more of a political question. Someone's asking, how do we convince the current Ontario government to stop using ministerial zoning orders? So I don't know if you want to comment on that, or I'll mention that Ontario Nature is working quite hard on this, and people can contact Ontario Nature if they really want to work on that.
Yeah, there's a good number of groups that are working on the ministerial zoning or bypass laws, or the veto law. Yeah, I think I was talking to somebody at Toronto Regional Conservation Authority, and there were something like 30 MZOs in place, or that were moving forward. So it's really it beggars belief. And I guess, and I live out in the East End, or in Scarborough, so I'm not far from where they want to build on a provincially significant wetland to put up a warehouse in Duffins Creek. I know the area well, and so it is deeply disturbing. The work that we are doing is many of the other groups are working in a significant way on this. Ontario Nature is definitely doing that, and they're challenging this. Our work will be focused much more on the loss of potential around this southern connectivity. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to bring as many voices to this southern connectivity work as possible, because we actually think that that's where the strength is. And you've already seen it. You've seen people rising up against NZOs because I mean, it's happening all the way across the, wherever it's been suggested. We're seeing all kinds of groups that are coming up. And that's the, how do we fight the stuff that we don't like? And from a wildlands perspective, we're trying to build the vision of, look, we could go after this. And I guess what I'm hoping is we could start to explain how we can create jobs. I'm not sure if this stripe of provincial government is going to say yes to that. I do think that it's not a matter of whether it's Conservative, Liberal, or NDP, because under the Mike Harris government, they expanded the park system by 2.4 million hectares. So it's entirely possible for Conservative governments to do really good things on nature. And I don't know if it's a misguided vision. I don't know what it is, but it's just inconsistent, I think, with where Ontarians are. And I don't even think that it makes sense financially, because if you take Burlington, massive flooding has occurred there, and many hundreds of thousands of dollars lost in people's homes. If you look at Windsor, as I said, it's the flooding capital of Canada. It's even hard to get flood insurance there now. That's going to not only cost homeowners, but municipalities, because of all of the disaster relief that you have to invest in. So I just don't think it's a good idea. It doesn't make good planning sense.
We just remind that there's a reminder here that the province currently has a consultation period open right now about the expansion of the Greenbelt into the Guelph and Cambridge area. And you can submit your comments up until April 19th. And I presume that you'd be encouraging people to do that.
Yeah, in fact, I believe that the Greenbelt is going to be putting out some pieces on this, and we're going to be participating in that. And that's one of the reasons I showed that map, because I was just trying to say, look at all the potential for doing that. And so again, we're trying to build the vision of what you could get to. Many of the groups are working on the, how do you stop this other stuff? And I support that, but we're working on the vision of, let's get to greater connectivity. That's the path for the future.
So our next question is, what does the term protectant mean when you use it? So when we talk about having 17 or 30% of the land protected, what exactly does protected mean?
Yeah, so this is come about because the science says we need, well, and it varies. It could be anywhere from 30 to 70% in protection. And protection is defined by the IUCN at the international level is where ecological integrity is the highest purpose. So for example, Canada's Parks Act says that when parks are being managed or protected areas are being managed, they have to be managed to achieve ecological integrity. And a number of years ago, Wildlands League was successful in arguing for the same in Ontario parks legislation, that ecological integrity is the benchmark. And that's what technically counts under the IUCN definition of protected area. And so getting to that 30%, as I showed that little piece that Canada, Russia, China, and the four, Canada, Russia, China, and the US have all agreed to the 30 by 30. And so that will become part of the conversation. Are you actually protecting it for ecological integrity, or are you doing logging in a park like Algonquin? So getting to protection will be, having 30% of it so that it's being managed for ecological integrity. And it doesn't mean that other areas can't contribute ecological values. That's where you can build the network of, like, whether it's an ecological corridor or restoration areas that will provide other ecological services or accomplish ecological objectives. But it means that the strict protection in terms of ecological integrity needs to be at least 30%.
Okay, thank you. Someone is asking that you mentioned a Southern Ontario Nature Collective just in a few minutes ago, and they were just wondering what that collective is and how could they find it?
Yeah, I'm not really sure it has a website. I saw that question very quickly, and I might, all I can remember is the acronym is SONC, and I know it's Southern Ontario Nature, and I can't remember if it's collective or collaborative or whatever. We're actually members of it, and I can't remember it. It includes Ontario Nature and the Greenbelt and many other groups that are all in and around the Greenbelt area. And the reason it came together was it got a grant under the Challenge Fund to work on coming up with ideas around creating and expanding protection throughout sort of the Greenbelt area. And so that Southern Ontario Nature Collective, I'm calling it, group was, yeah, SONC, that's it, Coalition. Okay, there you go. I just couldn't remember the, so that's the name of it.
Okay, I don't see any more questions. As if someone has some questions, just quickly get them into the chat. We had a question about recording. We are recording this. Nature Guelph will eventually get this up onto the Nature Guelph YouTube channel, but we're relying on volunteers to get these up, and so sometimes they're a little slow getting up, but we'll hopefully get them up. And now we have another question for Janet, which is, Janet, you are optimistic about 30% protection by 2030, but you also talk about a conservation economy, which presumably is associated with protected land. What do you mean by a conservation economy?
So conservation economy is not only associated with protected land, but a conservation economy is about building back the natural world. So that could be ecological corridors, which don't have to be protected. And that's one of the things I like about ecological corridors, is it's a way of starting to accomplish ecological objectives without necessarily having to change the people get very testy about changing the jurisdiction of land. So if it can be, okay, it's the Greenbelt, we're not going to take it over and have it all be protected, but we're going to start to accomplish some ecological objectives. Maybe that's restoration. Maybe it's about building back a better hydrological functionality. So building more natural infrastructure so that it functions more perfectly in terms of water retention and moving water slowly or faster or whatever needs to happen in that area. It might be the conservation economy. It could literally be about seed growers. It could be about those who are now going to be in the business of growing the tree saplings that we're going to need to plant the 2 billion trees. It's everything from the ditch digger who's going to help us rejuvenate an area to the person who's actually going to help with land acquisition. It's everybody involved in conservation. It's the city planners, it's the engineers, it's the architects, it's the volunteers, it's the many people who come together to do translation, it's the Indigenous leadership, it's the Indigenous knowledge holders. It is everybody who's going to be involved in making nature come back in some areas and protected in other areas. So the conservation economy is all of the jobs that are associated with that. And the reason I talk about it that way is because we have, we have economies that are built on resource extraction. And I think we need to start building this conservation economy that's about building nature.
Thank you. So no more questions, but I have one, which is, what can we do individually and in our groups to support your work? And then the second part of that question is, what can we do locally to help build to the 30% protection by 2030?
Yeah, so I think that there are a lot of groups who are working on the 30%. And I mean, obviously, I think that Wildlands League is doing some leading edge work and really thinking in terms of building the 30% and how you would do that across Canada. So I think you can always support the work of Wildlands League. So thank you very much if you choose to do so. But there are many other projects that are underway and other groups that are working to support those and finding those amongst all the different environmental groups that are working on it. You could support the various projects that are working with Indigenous peoples as well. And there are programs right in your own backyard. Some of it is, like, I don't want to underestimate the value of the land acquisition and the restoration movement and the ability, even when I look at my hometown of London and I see to the west that we've got all of these regeneration projects going on along the Thames, that is going to build such vibrancy along that river. I'm really looking forward to it. And so I think that there are as many ideas and projects. There can be education projects, there can be talking about this at the kitchen table, or telling your neighbor about 30 by 30 and why it's important. And the conversations that we're just starting to have with the Biden administration are, what does 30 by 30 look like for North America? Why just think about Canada doing 30 by 30? What happens if, because the US has now promised 30 by 30. So if you're going to do 30 by 30 in the US, could we think about the Great Lakes as one area and doing 30 by 30 all around the Great Lakes, and what that would look like? And what does it mean for Yellowstone to Yukon, or for example, from the Adirondacks to Algonquin? And start to think about these mammal corridors and how nature should be functioning and what it would look like if it was really vibrant. So I think there are as many ways as you can possibly enter into this conversation. Birding is another way, just talking to people about that and the value of that. And to me, there's no point in us protecting the boreal and seeing ourselves get successful and maybe achieving 30% just by protecting in the boreal if we don't also do it in and around the towns in Southern Ontario, because the birds who are on the migration paths have to have somewhere to stop. So as much as you do in the lands that you might steward here are going to be helping on the whole trajectory along that corridor for those birds or those migrating species. So I think there's as many projects as you could possibly imagine.
So, and finally, does your organization have a newsletter or anything else that people could sign up for if they want to keep informed on Wildlands activities?
Yeah, I'm actually, I'll send it around so you can give it out on the group, but I'll maybe just put our website up here, but you can sign up on our website for sure. That's our website. And then just trying to think if just see, I've got a couple of, oh, I know, maybe I'll just, I'll give you the connectivity one. That's got a bunch of information about the Southern Connectivity, and you can sign up there and get more information. It's probably one of the, we're going to be revamping our major website, but the, just trying to see if I have it. Social windows. See what I've got here. Oh, there it is. So this is probably the one I would recommend. It's the Nature Connectivity one. I've just sent this around on the chat, but you can see it's got some of these maps around connectivity in the south and shows you some of those projects. And we'll be putting up our Greenbelt expansion listserv here, so you can see that. This is the one about Windsor. So we'll be doing the Greenbelt ones going up, I think, in a couple of weeks. Yeah. So that's how you can find out a bit more about us, and you can see our marine website as well. We've actually got a really, I noticed, I really liked your land acknowledgement. I'll just say that up the top. I thought it was a really good one. I'm almost always listening to see what people's land acknowledgements are going to be. One of the things that we're doing right now is we've just launched a thank you campaign to the Mushkegowuk people for protecting or wanting to protect the marine conservation area up north. And so we've launched this website, and if you want to thank the Mushkegowuk people for protecting Hudson Bay, James Bay, this is a little bit about that and the project. And that's Sam fishing on the shores of Hudson Bay. But down here we have at the bottom, there's a a sample letter that you can fill out and send that in, and the chief and council will get that. And one of the reasons we think it's really important to do that is because you've got Indigenous people who are living at the very top of Ontario, and they're doing this because they think it's the right thing to do. Their elders call the peatlands the cooling and breathing lands of the planet. The Hudson Bay and James Bay is where they play. It's where they hunt and fish, and they want to see it stay healthy. And they also think this is really important for the planet. and this is just how they think and how this is their ethos. And so for them to feel like somebody else is paying attention to that and somebody else cares that they're doing this, and they've put it forward and said to Canada, we want to have a conversation with you. We want to protect this. That's no small feat. That's pretty hard for them to do. So I think if what we've launched is a thank you campaign, we're asking people to send thank you letters to them and say, thanks for taking care of this land and thank you for putting it forward as a protected area. So we're asking people to send in their letters, and you can go to that website and you can use, we've got a sample letter there, but feel free, please feel free to personalize it and make it as passionate as you want and let them know that you're paying attention and you're supporting Canada to do that.
Well, thank you, Janet. I don't see any more questions in the talk, but you've certainly, I can tell from the questions that people are very interested in this topic, and I'm sure they're going to be checking into your website. So I'm going to, on behalf of Nature Guelph and Waterloo Region Nature, here on Fringe Nature and Saugeen Nature, I'm going to thank you very much for a really good talk. And someone has just asked for a link for the thank you letters. So could you put that up?
I believe I put it in there. Yeah. Oh, no, I didn't. So sorry about that. I showed you the website, but I didn't. Yeah,
showed it to us, yeah.
I didn't put the link. So let me just get that. Yeah, so if you go to that marine page, and then it's just at the very bottom, and you can just scroll down and get to that. You can send your letters in, and I think we're at about 250 letters to the chief right now, and the U.S. Audubon Society, or U.S. Audubon Association, I can't remember what the rest of the title, U.S. Audubon are sending in a letter, and or have sent in a letter. We've got a few other big names to send in as well, and you can spread the word, give it to your networks, get people to send thank yous. And I think if the videos that I shared, I sent around the link to that, and if you do get a chance to listen to it, the music is by Adrian Sutherland, and he's from Attawapiskat, so he's from the Mushkegowuk area, and any thank yous or references to that would also be appreciated, so please take a look.
Well, thank you. And I'm going, unless there's any more questions, I'm going to thank Janet one more time and thank you all for attending. And I'll just remind you, we have a lot of events coming up in the next month. Everybody is welcome. Welcome to the other nature groups. And you can check out our Facebook page for Nature Guelph, and all those events are listed along with the links to sign up for the Zoom meetings. So thank you very much, Janet.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Oh, and the recording hopefully will be up, but I can't tell you when.